Good evening. How are you doing?
Good.
Good. It's my pleasure to introduce Kevin Werbach. Kevin and I have known each other for some years, mostly through the legal community. And the hard part about introducing Kevin is that his CV goes on for about 7 pages, so we'll be here for about 25 minutes time. So I'll hit a couple of key highlights. Among other things, Kevin has been the editor of Release 1.0 with working with Esther Dyson and Adventures. For many years, Kevin worked with the government, mostly FCC, but also other departments, Obama Transition Group on FCC issues, working with FCC on broadband issues, and more recently and currently, associate professor at Wharton on legal issues, business ethics. So the best part about asking Kevin about net neutrality is that he provides the insider knowledge and experience with an outsider's perspective. So that's it's not that you have a single axe to grind. You've seen all of the axes and you ground a couple of them yourselves over the years. So with that, the first couple questions essentially, and I know recently FCC issued its net neutrality ruling, which goes on 600 pages or plus. So the first 3 questions are going to be, what is net neutrality, what isn't net neutrality, and what hath FCC wrought?
Okay. So first thing I'll say is I'm not going to be nearly as entertaining as John Oliver explaining this. So if you haven't seen the video that he did on net neutrality, just Google John Oliver Dingo. It'll come right up. So here's the simplest way I can think to explain it. How many of you think the internet is awesome? That it's an amazing platform for innovation, communication, community, everything. All right? How many of you want to keep it that way? Okay, so that's what net neutrality is about. Basically, net neutrality is about whether the companies that provide the infrastructure of the internet can discriminate and control the content and applications and services that ride on top of the internet. The great challenge is that the internet is a public resource. It's an open platform for permissionless innovation. Tiny startups can become huge companies. Anyone can communicate on it. But the infrastructure is all run by private companies. And those private companies need capital to invest. Networks cost a lot of money to build, a lot of money to operate, a lot of money to scale. And they need to make a return. And they need the freedom to innovate themselves. So the question is, how do you draw the line? How do you ensure that the platform providers, the Comcast and AT&Ts and Verizons of the world, that they have the freedom to run their business, but that they don't use their control over the network infrastructure to, for example, block services that compete with them, or degrade services that might threaten some of their revenue streams? And how do we even tell? The fascinating thing about net neutrality is that at this point, pretty much everyone agrees with the principles. You go and talk to Comcast and all these other companies, and they will say, yeah, we agree. The internet is open, it should be permissionless, companies should have this opportunity to go on the internet and not have to depend on us to build their business. There's 2 basic questions that everyone fights about. The first is, how do we draw the line in deciding what are the enforceable rules? So principles are great, but what practice is legitimate, what practice is not? So, for example, if a company engages in what's called a paid prioritization deal. So Netflix does a deal with Comcast that Netflix traffic will run faster to customers over the Comcast network. They want lower latency, they want better performance, they're willing to pay for that. Is that a problem? Is it a problem that other companies that might want to compete with Netflix don't necessarily have access to that deal? Or maybe Comcast will pick and choose who it provides that to, or maybe they'll provide such low-quality service without the paid prioritization that everyone that wants to reach their customers has to do it. How do you draw that line? How do you come up with a rule that allows for legitimate business negotiation and cuts back on the inappropriate discrimination? Because fundamentally, people often talk about net neutrality as everything on the internet should be treated equally. That's not how networks work, right? Certainly no one would say denial of service traffic and spam should all be treated equally. Certainly no one would say we should tell banks and hospitals that they can't get reliable delivery of their traffic when it matters. And certainly no one would say that you shouldn't be able to pay more for higher bandwidth for your broadband service. So the question is, how do we draw these lines in a way that's enforceable so that we don't have too much government interference and this thing works out? Second question is wonkier and more legal. What's the FCC's legal authority to do it? Scary thing is, I went to the Federal Communications Commission in 1994, right after I got out of law school, and the big issue I worked on back then, 20 years ago, was the legal structure under the U.S. communications laws for regulation of internet services. Guess what we're fighting about now? Exact same issue. And so that's what a lot of the debates have been about. So there's been a series of rulings, and I'll cut off in a second, but 2010, the FCC adopted a set of enforceable net neutrality rules after many years of debate. Last year, they were overturned in court because the court said the FCC actually had legal authority to regulate broadband services, but they didn't have the authority to put the kind of rules in place that they did. So the FCC went back to the drawing board, started a proceeding last year, went through various twists and turns. About a month and a half ago, they adopted these new net neutrality rules, and as part of that, they did what's called reclassification. They classified broadband access, not all internet services, just broadband internet access, as what's called a telecommunications service. So it's under the same broad section of the Communications Act as things like telephone service, but they limited the kinds of rules that apply to basically these non-discrimination rules. So that's what the FCC has adopted. It was just in the last couple of days published formally in the Federal Register and already subject to about, I think, 4 lawsuits so far and more coming. So that's where we are at this point. Okay, I'll try to be shorter with the rest of the answers.
So what does the lawsuit say? So why FCC can't do this? And how long do we expect it will be before the FCC, before we hear from the courts on this? I assume it's something we'll be hearing about 3 days after the lawsuit.
No. So we probably will get this going into court probably 2016, and a decision maybe later that year, maybe 2017. The 2010 rules were overturned by the court in December 2014. So that was 4 years. It won't be that long, but it'll be 2 to 3 years before we have an answer. This very well may get appealed to the Supreme Court. A bunch of arguments they're making, and again, I don't want to get too wonky in the weeds. One argument is a procedural argument. When the FCC started the proceeding last year, the chairman of the FCC, Tom Wheeler, someone who I've had the good fortune of working with, a really very honorable, very smart guy who wants to do right for the American people, he decided not to do initially this reclassification. He said we should keep the existing set of rules that the FCC had in place for the last 10 years where broadband services were what are called information services. They're in the same bucket as Google or Facebook or anyone else. They're not in the same bucket as telephone service. That was the original proposal. The response was tremendous outcry. I talked about the John Oliver video, 4 million comments filed with the FCC. I was actually the guy who set up the FCC's first website and first email comment box 20 years ago. The scary thing is they're still running some of the same infrastructure, but crashed the network, 4 million comments. Lots of people were really upset the FCC was not applying these stronger rules. And lots of debate went back and forth. Eventually, President Obama weighed in. The FCC just changed its mind. So they decided not to go forward with the original proposal, but to go forward with this Title II reclassification proposal. So one argument that's being made in the lawsuits is they didn't give proper notice. Administrative agencies have to deal with all of these procedural requirements in their decision making. One of them is they have to tell people, they have to give notice so people can comment on what they're doing. So one argument is what they proposed was different from what they did. Second argument is for more than 10 years, and this is in several rulings time after time again, including the 2010 net neutrality rules, the FCC has said broadband is an information service. Now, all of a sudden, they're saying, no, broadband's not an information service. Broadband is a Title II telecommunications service. And so one argument that's made with the legal challenge is there's a high bar, so it's claimed, for them to change their mind. What's really changed? have the circumstances changed enough that they can change their decision. Given that, the argument is made by the broadband companies, we spent tens, maybe hundreds of billions of dollars during that time investing in our networks with the assumption of one regulatory regime. Third argument is this classification the FCC made doesn't work, that they actually can't find broadband as a telecommunications service because it's inherently about information processing and networking. There are definitions in the statute, the 1996 Communications Act, about what's an information service. And fourth argument is about this issue of paid prioritization. The FCC said paid prioritization is banned. So that kind of arrangement I talked about, where Netflix might say, we want to pay so our traffic is treated better on the network, can't do it. Can't even argue that it's a legitimate practice, can't do it. And so one argument in the legal challenge is the FCC can't, without any evidence that the practices are actually discriminatory or actually harming competition, decide ahead of time across the board to ban those practices. Those, I think, are the major challenges that are getting brought.
Given the current approach, let's assume that goes forward, lawsuits are resolved one way or another. Assuming the current approach the FCC is taking, one or two examples of how the FCC might rule on a particular issue that would be net neutrality and one that wouldn't be. A couple of examples of how this actually might be implemented in types of services that are or are not being provided.
Sure. So part of this is we don't know. And to me, I've been arguing for a very long time, the real issue here is whether there's a cop on the beat, whether the FCC has legal authority to address abuses when they happen. Because the network evolves, and we want it to evolve. We don't know what the challenges are going to be. So the biggest example that got the FCC involved was in 2007. Comcast engaged in a network management regime that was throttling peer-to-peer services. They were slowing down a whole range of peer-to-peer services, including BitTorrent, but all kinds of other things. And it was far too broad. It was slowing down lots of entirely legitimate services. And Comcast, I think genuinely, convincingly said, you know what, we screwed up. We were not trying to throttle BitTorrent because we were worried about competition with cable. But even they admitted we went way too far. And it was only because a complaint was filed and the FCC got involved and said, no, this is discrimination. You can't just decide peer-to-peer services get slowed down, whether they're involving infringement or not. That was 7-8 years ago. And so as the network evolves, as we get more of these high bandwidth services, video services, things like not just Netflix, these massive broadcast streaming services, but things like Periscope and Meerkat, individual one-on-one video. What kinds of arrangements are going to be necessary to have all that traffic flowing through the network? It doesn't just happen. It involves a lot of investment and a lot of traffic engineering by all these companies to make that work. So the issue is going to be, where do you draw the line? Two other quick issues where I think we'll see this debate. One is what's called interconnection. So net neutrality, when it was first started, was just about what the broadband company does on its network. So once the traffic gets onto Comcast network, gets delivered from someone else's network or from an intermediary network like Level 3, transit network, what happens with the traffic from there to when it gets to you? Do they discriminate? Do they differentiate and say this traffic goes on this type and this traffic goes on that type? But really, and I've been saying this, I was arguing this for about 8 years in law review articles, that's not where most of the action is going to be. Most of the action is going to be how the traffic gets onto their network. And so Comcast and Netflix actually made a deal that didn't say traffic goes faster on the Comcast network. It said we have a more direct route from Netflix origin servers into Comcast network. Once it gets onto Comcast, it gets treated like everything else. But the result of that deal, that direct interconnection, as opposed to going through various intermediary networks, where Netflix was saying that Comcast was deliberately not upgrading their network, was much faster performance. Netflix had to pay. Now, they were paying these other networks before. They had to pay something now directly to Comcast. How much? We don't know. Confidential deal. So part of the issue here is, there's no transparency about what's going on. having an agency like the FCC that can look at the evidence to decide if it's anti-competitive is really important. Second example is what's called zero rating. So we're starting to see, initially on wireless, and one big issue is the old 2010 FCC net neutrality rules largely exempted wireless, purely from a political deal. Was an attempt to gain support from the industry and saying wireless, it's not that big, we'll sort of let it go without these same rules. There's lots of differences technically, wireless and wired. There's certainly lots of more need to manage networks given the unreliability of wireless connections. But fundamentally, there is discrimination that's okay, and there's discrimination that's inappropriate, and that's true whether you're on a wired or a wireless pipe. So this time around, the FCC extended the net neutrality rules to wireless as well. Issue of zero rating is if you have a service with a metered plan, or a data cap, which again, lots of us have now for wireless, but increasingly there's talk about this for wired, certain traffic being exempted from the cap. So T-Mobile has a service like this that they've been trying for music services. There's lots of discussions about content providers paying the network operators so that their traffic is exempt from the cap. This is actually being done a lot in the developing world where connectivity is really expensive, and it's actually coming in a lot of cases from the content provider. So Google and Facebook are paying network operators in places like Africa so that their traffic is free. Even Wikipedia is doing this. So you don't have to pay to get access to Google. If you want to get to other stuff, you have to pay, but this makes it a lot cheaper. And the question is that okay? The argument that it's okay is private deal, makes it cheaper, mutually agreeable deal, you can still get to everything else. The argument against is, well, this could be really pernicious. If you give the network operator the opportunity to say, well, you've got to use our zero rating deal or your traffic is going to be really slow and expensive, then it gives them a lot of power. So I think that's two areas we're going to see a lot of action in the next couple of years.
Okay. Let me open up. One back here.
All right.
Sounds well prepared, Brad.
BYOR.
To continue with the last statement, what about walking into Starbucks where they're providing free wireless and they are prioritizing traffic or blocking access to specific sites, requiring me to log in to give them essentially lead generation? Can they look at that or change my ability to access anything?
So I don't know. I mean, Starbucks, I don't think would be classified as a broadband internet access service provider. There's a particular definition about what those networks are. But yeah, I think we'll see more of this debate, especially when you have lots of people now using those Wi-Fi networks. Increasingly, we're going beyond just the site-based networks to these local networks. The basic principle is the same, but the question is, in each case, where do you draw the line so that, again, companies have the opportunity to make a return and to prevent certain kinds of activity they don't want to allow legitimately?
The NCAA turned off Wi-Fi in all of the venues except for access to their own paid NCAA tournament app.
Right. Yeah, and so the challenge is a lot of that might be troubling, but again, the question is what should be the rule? And if you have a rule that says anyone who puts up a Wi-Fi access point can't block access to anything, then first of all you have a situation where you're putting this huge responsibility of the FCC to police all of this different kinds of activity, including lots of non-commercial, small-scale activity, and not necessarily being clear where to draw the line. So yeah, again, the issue is whether there's a problem. What's the problem? What's the alternative? What's the cause of it? Is there a legitimate reason for that? And is there a forum where both sides can provide evidence? And that's, again, I think really the issue here, and this is the FCC's rules try to provide this environment where they asserted legal authority. There's lots of these areas where they haven't decided. They've said, all right, this interconnection issue, we think we can address it, but we are not going to step in now. Come to us if you see a problem, show the evidence, and we'll have a public process to decide. I think that's what we're going to see in a lot of those areas. I think that's what we should see. It's impossible for any of us to anticipate exactly what the issues are and to come up with some general principle that applies to everything across the board.
So as an example, one question we have from the audience goes to essentially all the municipal infrastructures, if there's a broadband provider that's providing slower access to that infrastructure, whether it's a municipal structure or it's a nonprofit, that's something that the FCC would get involved in. What I'm hearing, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is that we don't know until the complaint is made to the FCC.
Yeah, well, so again, net neutrality is about the network operator, the access provider, discriminating about what goes over their network. So it's not about your service is slower than a competing network operator. But part of what that goes to is a big reason that this is such a problem, not the only reason, but a big reason is we don't have enough competition for broadband access. And we especially don't have enough competition for high-speed, next-generation broadband access in this country. To the extent that there's more of that, this is something the FCC is working on. For example, lots of states have laws that preclude municipal competition. They say if a city wants to put in a fiber network, can't do it. So the FCC is trying to preempt some of those laws to facilitate more competition, do other things with wireless to facilitate more competition. Ultimately, the competitive pressure is really the best solution here. But yeah, you wouldn't get involved just because the service is not fast. It's part of the problem that a lot of the outcry about net neutrality was people saying things like, Comcast has really terrible service. Like, it takes way too long to get service, and their people are dumb. And I love Comcast; they're a great company. I have a lot of great friends there. But the reality is, lots of people think that. That's what net neutrality is not about. It's not about someone magically coming in from the government and saying, provide better customer service. What's going to do that ultimately is competitive pressure. And we're already starting to see that. So Google is launching fiber. They announced 8 cities in the US and spreading out beyond. There's actually untold story, lots of innovation happening in competitive fiber networks in lots of parts of the United States. So we're starting to see some of the incumbents finally moving, deploying their own gigabit infrastructure.
Question in the back.
Hi. Does the net neutrality work both ways? In other words, it tries to prohibit the content provider from buying a higher priority with the ISP. Does it also prohibit the ISP from charging maybe a premium to the subscriber for getting their content faster?
So net neutrality is about what the network operator can do with the content provider. So just a clarification, it says Comcast can't offer that faster speed deal to Netflix. It doesn't regulate Netflix directly. But even if Netflix says, I want you, Comcast, to offer that to me on your network, they can't do it. But yes, it's about the relationship between the network and services on the network. It's not specifically about end user pricing, but the problem is all that gets swept in. So the zero rating issue I talked about comes into play when you've got metering and data caps. And metering and data caps can be entirely legitimate, especially on a wireless network. Capacity is not infinite. Or it can be a blunt instrument that's used to limit competition and limit services that people are using. So the FCC is starting to get into this issue of end user pricing. But the net neutrality rules themselves only talk about and focus on the operator discriminating against what are called edge providers, content providers, application providers, and so forth on their network.
Thank you.
Now, you also mentioned, and this is perhaps the prior question, because one of the drivers here is that there's so relatively few choices in broadband. Is it possible that one of the responses to this is that FCC changes rules or Congress changes rules to require more access, or to reduce those current barriers to having more broadband providers? And then that rolls back, that becomes the basis of rolling back the neutrality rules.
Yeah, the challenge is you can't beat the stone and make something happen. Again, this is companies deploying billions of dollars of private capital to build these networks. And the solution is not government will build it or government will tell companies you will build these networks. It's just not going to work. So the question is how to incentivize more private competition. And so that's something the FCC is working on, not in the net neutrality proceeding. And actually one of the challenges has been they've been so caught up in this massive political food fight around net neutrality in the last year and a half. It's made it harder for them to work on these other issues. But they are addressing, as I said, the state laws that restrict broadband competition. They're looking at, these seem like really like wonky, low-level issues. Pole attachments. So what does it cost you as a competing broadband provider to literally get access to telephone poles, to string your wire along the telephone poles? Because that's the scarce resource often for building a fiber optic network, is what it costs you, what the utility company charges for the telephone pole access. And there's very different rates. Some providers get charged far more than other providers. So that's something the FCC is looking at. Conduit space, lots and lots of these issues that feed into it. At the end of the day, government can help a lot. There's a lot that it's doing. But it's going to be entrepreneurs and companies starting to innovate. That's ultimately what's going to happen. And I think 20 years from now, we're going to have actually lots of competitive fiber. I hope it's a lot sooner than that, but it takes time.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you all.